Ciao friends! In this video I want to explore how we can consume a DAX queries in Excel. This is a question I receive often. We can create queries in DAX Studio, we have a query builder, but how can we consume these queries? Because Power BI doesn't have a tool to create a report based on the result of a DAX query. That is another tool, is paginated report. But in reality, I want to show you that Excel can consume these DAX queries in a very effective way. And I want to show you at least one use case that could be very relevant to your work. So let's start describing the scenario, then we will see how I can move the data into Excel, and then I will try to adapt the query and customize the query based on the Excel input, because I want to create something that doesn't require to use DAX Studio every day. I want to create a query that I will use with different parameters over time. So let's try. I'm not sure that we will realize everything in the right way in the first attempt. By the way, I'm not an expert of VBA in Excel, so I have to look at some function probably on internet. And the format of this video is unplugged, so no cuts. We will see all the errors, all the mistakes, because sometimes people like to see what is the process we follow to reach the conclusion. And my goal is to simply create an Excel report. This is the idea based on a DAX query. So let's start from the first example. Okay, this is the Excel file I prepared to start, but let's start from this Power BI. So from this Power BI file, this is the Contoso database. We have a Contoso database we use often. And as you see, besides navigating into my report, I want to create something like a list of the transactions I have in my report. You see that here I have a list of name of the customer, product name, city, quantity, sales amount for each order, maybe for each line of the order. Now, if we look at the data model, you see that the data model is something like this. So let me just upgrade this, where we have a sales table, we have product, we have store, customer, several tables. And if you think for a moment, the content of my report has data coming from different tables. So I have to use the join between these tables defined by the relationships, because I want to produce this detailed report. But usually you don't want this report to be in Power BI. You want to get this data in Excel. And yes, I can export this data. I can go here and I can export the data, and I can create a CSV file that I can import in Excel. But if I do that, every single time I change the date, for example, guess what? I go here and I select a different date. Now my report is automatically updated, but then I have to export this data again. Imagine you want to get the list of the invoices that are still open, the list of the customers who fulfill certain parameters, certain details of the analysis you want to get. So how can we approach the problem? Well, first of all, let's see if we can do this in Excel. I already published this report in Power BI. So you will see that I will use the same model locally, like I have now, and connect it to the cloud. So let's see if I can go to Excel now. And here in Excel, I can connect to my Power BI dataset. I have here all the dataset in my tenant. I look for Contoso that I previously published. And Contoso is here. Oh, by the way, this version of Contoso has 12 million rows in the sales table, a few thousands of customers, a few thousands of products. And usually the performance of Contoso is very good, but let's see what happens if I try to create the same kind of report we have seen in Power BI. So we had the sales amount. The sales amount is the sum of all the transactions. We had a filter by date, so let's use the date here. Let's get the date, and let's pick one date where we have data. I remember that we have data in 2008 or 2009, so we go in any date of 2008 is fine. The number of sales amount changed, and now I want to include the order number. So I go here, I look for order number, which is the first column I want to see here. So far so good, the performance is very good, but let's see what happens if I add the customer name and, oops, sorry, I'll probably have just to look for the customer, and here, look for the name. Customer name is here, and I immediately notice that this is a pivot table in Excel. The default visualization is a pivot table. I don't like this layout, I just like a table, so I go here, I set this in tabular format. I still have this group by, but let's move forward. So we can fix this later, because the problem I want to show you is that I move forward and I include here, for example, the product name. So I go in product, and I get the product name, and I put the product name here. Now you see that it took a few, maybe 1 second now, but I also have the store city. I think the store city here that I included in the other report, and probably also I have the quantity. So I go here, I look for the quantity, and I include the quantity here. I don't want to sum the quantity, I want to just see the total of the line of each quantity. Now, the more columns I add to this report, the slower it becomes. And sometimes this could be, extremely slow. It is not too slow this time, and I don't want to add too many columns at the moment, but probably this is an experience you already had. If you use a larger monitor, more number of columns, you include a lot of columns coming from different tables. What happens is that at a certain point, the pivot table is very slow. And there is another problem that I mentioned before. We don't actually want the subtotals. I already got rid of the subtotal, but we have here a similar layout of what I want to obtain in Power BI. But every time I change this date, so if I go here and set a different date, you see that it takes, in this case, 1-2 seconds, but it's easy, you get 10, 15, 20 seconds when you have a complex layout with a lot of columns. So my goal is to try to leverage my knowledge of DAX to get something faster. And how can I do that? Well, let's start with one consideration. Here, when you have a measure, sales amount is a measure, is an aggregation of data. If I double click a single cell here, you see what happens. You have what is called the drill-through in Excel. The drill-through in Excel is a specific feature that gets the underlying data in the fact table, in this case in the sales table, the table that contains the definition of the measure, and shows all the visible columns of that table here. Actually, all the columns, not just the visible ones. But the problem is that if I look at this report, that could be interesting because now I see the detail of a single row. But if I go back to my pivot table and I go to the grand total for the day and I do the same double click here, this is the total of the day, you see that now I have more transactions. I have all the transactions, actually the first 1,000 transactions that are within the range of selection I made in the filter of the pivot table. So basically I have all the transactions of one day because I selected only one day. But again, this is not exactly what I want. It's extremely fast to produce this report, but there are two problems. One, I only have a limit of 1,000 rows. You can see here that there is a limit of 1,000 rows. We can change it, but give me 1 second. But the other problem is that I don't have the full control over the columns. I have one row for every transaction in the sales table, but I don't have the columns I want. I don't see the name of the customer. I don't see the name of the product. I just see some internal information like the online sales key, or if I move forward, we have the order number, which is what I want. But for the customer, I cannot see the name of the customer. I cannot see here the customer name. So even though this information is not displayed here, I can retrieve this information by modifying the underlying query. So what happened at this point? Remember, we had our Excel file connected to Power BI. So let's go to the whiteboard where I can show you this with some, oops, not this one, sorry. I want to get this one. So we are in the cloud here. So this is our Power BI service. And we publish here our dataset. So let's call it, this is our Contoso dataset, right? Now, when I used my Excel file here with Excel, I'm using the connection analyzing Excel, or I connected Excel to the dataset, is the same thing, the principle is the same. And what I have here is a connection where enables Excel to retrieve the data. Let me just move this a little bit. So I can get in Excel the data coming from Contoso. Now, what is happening is that in this connection, I have actually two different connections. One is for the pivot table, which is this one. The result you see here, this is the pivot table that we obtained by, let's go here. This is the pivot table I obtained before by including the different columns with a pivot table user interface. But when I use the double click, what I have here is a completely different result. What we have here, let me close this one. What we have here is a table with a query using the same connection used by the pivot table. What does it mean? If I go here in table, you see here in edit query two things. First, this string. This connection string enables Excel to connect to Power BI. Even though you don't have Power BI Premium, which would use the XMLA endpoint, this connection works with Power BI Pro. So you don't need an expensive license to use this connection. And in this connection, you can execute any MDX or DAX query that retrieve data. Now, Excel generates an MDX query. The query we see here is MDX, but the tabular engine in Power BI can execute MDX query. And this query is saying, give me the first 1,000 rows from the model where this filter is applied and give me the underlying data for this measure sales amount. Now, the definition of the underlying data for sales amount is defined in the model. And at the moment, we cannot change it in Power BI, it's not supported. But so one thing I could do, I could change this number. I could change the number of rows. Instead of getting the first 1,000, I could get the first 10,000 or 100,000. And it would be fast. If I use here 5,000, for example, I don't know how many rows I have. Now it is executing the query again, and you see if I go at the bottom, I have actually 5,000 rows, and it took more or less the same amount of time. But I cannot change the shape of this query. The good news is that in this connection, instead of using an MDX query, I could use a DAX query. I could replace here my MDX code with the DAX code. And now that you understand the principle of that, we can go to DAX Studio and start to create we can use DAX Studio to create the query we want that produces the result we want, and we can replace it here. Or, much better, we can create from scratch an Excel file in DAX Studio, and we can just copy this string, because this is the string that enables me to connect to my Contoso data model. So if I have this string doesn't include the credential. I still have to authenticate myself, but with this string, I can point to that dataset in Excel, in a table in Excel, not just in a pivot table. So the idea, let me go back to the whiteboard 1 second. The idea is the following. What I want to do, now we have an MDX query here generated by Excel. What I want to do, I want to get rid of this, and I want to replace this with a DAX query. And how do I obtain this DAX query that defines exactly the set of data that I want? I will use here my DAX Studio. Because DAX Studio has a user interface to create a query builder. And I could use DAX Studio connected to Power BI, but in this case, if I have to connect to Power BI, I need to use the XMLA endpoint. It's at the moment of recording, the XMLA endpoint is available in general as a general availability as a feature, but the premium license requires a premium capacity, and the premium per user is in preview. Probably in a few months, in March, April, I don't know, the premium per user will be available to everyone, but not every user will have that. However, the idea is that the technique I want to show can be used also by Power BI Pro users without the premium license, because the connection I want to use, which is this one, the connection here will be still the connection used by Power BI Pro. But as I said, the DAX Studio cannot use this connection, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect DAX Studio to my Power BI desktop, right? Because I have desktop, sorry. So I have the same local copy of my Contoso. So this is the Contoso dataset I published on the web. It's actually a file I have here. So I connect DAX Studio to the PBIX file Contoso, sorry. I should stop trying to write with a pen with a wiper, right? So this is my goal. I want to connect the Studio here. I want to create my DAX query here. So I will write my DAX code. Then I want to get this DAX code and put this DAX code here so that I will replace the DAX code we have seen before, reusing the same connection I have to connect to the right dataset. Once I do that, I could try to customize the Excel file so that I can change the query in a dynamic way. Okay, this is the goal. So now I move to DAX Studio. We will go back to Excel later. So back to the demo machine and back to Power BI Desktop. How can we start DAX Studio? We go in the external tools, having DAX Studio installed, we click DAX Studio. Here we go. So this should be the easy part, because basically what we want to do, we want to create a query with a query builder. I'm connected to the same data model I have in the cloud, and what I want to do, I want to get the sales amount here. I want to get the, if I remember, I wanted to see the order number. So I put the order number here. I put the customer name here. So let's get this customer name. I think I also got the product name. So I go in product and I get the name. Here we go. And of course, if I wanted to write the query in DAX immediately, I could have done that. But I just want to show that even though I don't have a very deep knowledge of DAX, I can still create the query. I think the city. Here we go. Now, I don't run the query now because it would be huge. Remember, we have 12 million rows. So I want to apply a filter. So how do I apply a filter? I move the date here in the filter pane, and I say, well, I want this is, let's get the same date we used in Excel. It was 25 August, 8/25, 2008. And we run the query just to see the result is the same. Okay, the result is the same. You see that the query is very fast in this case. And the query returned 19,000 rows, which is probably less we had before. There is some more detail we have there. I will check this later. But what I want to do, I want to see the query in DAX. Now, this is my DAX query. And if I copy and paste this query in Excel, it should work. So let me try. So I copy this query this way. I go in Excel And again, you can write table, edit query, and you can paste the code here, okay? Now, we are not creating a configuration for the date. The date is fixed in the query at the moment, but just to see if it works, if I click run, here we go, we have the result. As you see, probably I made some mistake, I made some different, because the result is different. Probably I'm not using the same data. Oh, actually, the difference is that in the previous case, I was using all the rows in the sales table for that date. Now I'm aggregating those rows by sales order number, customer and product names, or city, sales amount, which means that if there is a detail for order line number for the same product, probably it is collapsed into the same rows. But the idea is that I can customize this query. I can obtain the granularity and the columns that I want. Now, remember, I'm still using the connection I got by using the Excel UI, because I will not be able alone to create such a connection. But it's good to know that you can do something similar in DAX Studio. You see that I created the query here in DAX Studio by using run, but I could change the output, and one of the output is linked. Linked creates an Excel file, actually creates an ODC file, which is a connection string with a query that I wrote. Let me try. So if I click this output dynamic and I click run, what happens is that the file ODC, temporary file ODC, has been saved in my temporary folder. And if I enable this connection, what I get is an empty Excel file with just a table, with just a query, using the connection that in this case is the local connection. Let me go back here. What I'm doing now, I'm using, let's see if this works. Here we go. Okay, so I'm using this connection here. Yes, I'm using, sorry, I had a problem. So I'm using this connection here, which connects DAX Studio to the local Power BI desktop file. What I want to use, I want to replace this connection with the connection we used before, here, this one. How can I retrieve this connection? Well, I can go back to Excel. So this is the Excel file I created using DAX Studio. So if I go in edit query, you see that this is the connection string that is connecting the local file. You see that here we have we have this local host with a number which identifies the local connection. But if I replace this connection string with the connection string we had in the other file, so let's go back to the other model in Excel. This is the model connected to Power BI. I can go here and I can get this longer connection string. Now I go back to my model, to my query here, and you could do this, right? So this is an initial step. So we could replace the connection string. Now I'm connecting to the cloud and I'm executing the query on the cloud. So this is the first step. I had the right connection string, I had the right query. But I need another step, which is I want to change the date in the query. And potentially what I want to do, let's create here a couple of rows. Remember, I'm not an Excel expert, but let's say if I write here date and I want to type a date. And when I type a date, I want to refresh this query automatically. Can I do that? So let's try. So let's say that I write here 8/15/2008. What I want to do at this point is I want to modify the query I have here. How can I do that? Well, I can enable the developer ribbon here. Let me see. Here we go. The developer ribbon allows me to record a macro. And by recording a macro, I can discover the VBA code required to modify the string. How? Well, let's see. If I start recording a macro, let's call this macro 1, what happens is that every step I do is recorded in VBA. And I have no idea about the VBA code to retrieve the property where I have the query, the DAX query. And I have to replace the date with something else. So what I can do, I can go here in Edit Query. I can manually change, for example, this number using another number, 14, and I click OK. Now you see that as a side effect, I refreshed this table, but now what I was interested to was looking at the macro created by using this operation. So let me move this here. Let's see what happened. So you see that this object, selection, list object, query table, connection, blah, blah, blah. So basically starting from the selection, from the selected element, it modified the property. So the connection property contains this string, which is the connection string. I'm not interested in changing that. The command type, not interested, but the command text is exactly what I want to change. So I want to replace the command text with something else. So let's see if I can obtain this in a better way. So first of all, let's go back to DAX Studio. Let's see, I lost my DAX Studio here. This is the query I want to control. Now, if you have seen in Excel, this query is written in the syntax of Visual Basic. I don't like it very much. So in order to be more flexible, I would like to put this query into an Excel cell, and I want to copy that cell into the connection. So it's easier to maintain my Excel workbook. So let's do that. So I copy this, I go to Excel, and I create here in Excel, I can copy and paste this code here. It's important I use a single cell, because otherwise, let's see if I can do this, okay. If I use a single cell, now how can I, okay, let's try again. So if I do this, okay, here we go. Because I wanted to set the right size here. So this cell includes the content for my query, which means if I have to change the code, I can just change this cell and I can copy this code into this query. So what I can do at this point, I can try to edit the macro, and I can replace this array here, array of string, with just the content of that cell, which is, I think that's a good point. I don't remember the syntax for doing that, so that's a good, I think there is a good way to do that. In Excel, I can name, I can provide a name to a cell, and I can provide a name to the table. So let's call this sales details, right? So the table has a name, so it's easier to reference the object in Excel probably, instead of using the simple coordinate. This is the date selected, or selected date is better, selected date. And in this other worksheet, I call this my query definition. Now let's call this DAX query, DAX query. Okay. Good. Now I have to retrieve the value of the cell DAX query. And again, because I'm not good at Excel, I can try to do this. So let me start another macro. So in order to retrieve the value of this cell, I can try to do a copy. And then I go here in the cell, and I paste the code. No, this doesn't work. So let's try to do the paste here. No. Let's try again. Control C and Control V here. And then I undo and stop the recording. Let's see what happened. Macro 2. Here we go. So, okay, I like this more. So we have a selection in a worksheet and a selection of a range. Now, if in the selection of the range I write the DAX query, if I remember If I do this, it should be, well, I don't want to do the selection, I just want to get the content of this, and so I hope that by just writing this code here, dot text, it should work, because I want to get the text value that I have in that range. Let's see if it works. So, save, and, oh, right, I didn't, okay, the test. All right, I had to save a file with the macro enabled, because we are writing macros. And let's try to execute this macro. So if I now go here, macros, and I will go in macro 1 and I will click run, it is not working. So let's see. All right, because this was using query table here. So I have to do the selection of the query, which is another thing I don't remember how to do that. So let's see if I can find a way to find this, because I provided a name to the table. So now if I do something like, okay, so let me record the macro again. Macro 3, I go in table, edit query, and I change this value again to 12, because okay, I hope that now, because I have a name, it should work. So, okay, but we could try using the range, the same technique. So if I try to use the range, and then I use the range, and then list object query table, it could work. So let's try. So this is the range here. Actually, table design is sales details. So let's try query table list object. Let's try to do this. List object. What is the name here? Sales details. So let's try to run this. It is not working because it's not working. Okay, so let's try to use the other technique. So we use the range and select. So we go back to the previous definition. And here we use this. I don't like it. Probably I have to look in a better way to make this selection. So, no, not sheet, but range. And instead of using this, we use sales details. Sales details, however, let's try to do this. So let's select the entire thing here and provide the name here, table details. That's probably, I think it didn't get the name. Let's try sales details. Maybe it works the same. So let's try to run this again. And this works. So this seems working. This seems working. So at this point, I can say, okay, I don't want to change the connection. I don't want to change the data type. I just want to change this DAX query with the text, right? So let's try to run this again. So if I go here and I change this number here to, for example, 1. This is something I didn't use before. Now I go in my macro and I run my macro again. This macro 1. I run the macro and it works. So my code is working, but I have to complete my customization by doing two things. I want to get the value I have here in this selected date cell, and I want to replace the date. Now, before doing this, let's go back to DAX Studio, because DAX Studio has the ability to use parameters in a query. What does it mean? I know that I want to use here, instead of a fixed date, I want to use a parameter, like, for example, selected date. As you see, when you start something with the @ symbol, this identifies a parameter, and when you run the query in DAX Studio, it asks you the value of the parameter. For example, 8/1/2008. But if I do that, every time I run the query, it asks me the same content again. Oh, by the way, this created another file because I didn't change the output. So let's go back to DAX Studio and let's fix the output to grid. We can cancel this query. So let's try again, run. You see that I'm asked every time. So a good idea is to write the parameter, for example, 81/2008, but click this button. This button includes in the DAX query what is called the XML definition of the parameter. When you have both elements into the same content in DAX Studio, or in the query that you send to the engine, the value defined here is automatically replaced in the placeholder for the parameter. So selected date becomes this value. The only reason I did this is because I wanted to create my query using this placeholder with the @ symbol, because now I can get this value, this string, I can go back to my model and I can include here my query. So you see that now I have my placeholder selected date. The only reason why I'm doing this is because in my macro, I want to search for this placeholder and I want to replace it with the value I have here. Let's do that. So I go in my macro, I go in edit, and by the way, I can get rid of these two macros. I no longer need them, so we can remove them. And here, so what I want to do, I want to replace. In this expression, which is the string that has the placeholder, I want to look for the string selected date, and I want to replace it with what? With a value that we have in range selected date. I hope I use this name, we will check in a moment, dot text. The only concern here, we have to use the text because the data type we know cannot be used in the query, because the query is just a string. The query we use here is just a string. And I'm not able, I don't know if we could use the replacement of the parameters using the connection string in Excel. So the easiest way to obtain what I want, I modify the string and I replace this placeholder with a value of the parameter I want. So let's try. So now I click run just to see if I made a mistake. And probably, I don't know if it is working. So let's see, the selected date here is right. So probably we have to put, there is something not working, but I don't know if, oh, right. I know what happened. The problem is that if I do the replacement, let me show you this in, if I do the replacement, what happens is that I remove this and I write this code, the date. But if you remember, if we do that, now this is no longer a valid DAX syntax, because now it's just like a division and the result is a number. And this number is a date that doesn't exist. So it doesn't raise an error, but it's not a valid date. If you want a valid date, we have to add the double quotes because it's a string. We start from a date, but we actually want a string. So because we need these delimiters, we have to write here double quote. I think this is the number, of course, we need. No, just one this way. Ampersand, 1, 1, 2, and 1. Okay, so let's try. So now if I run the query, the macro again, now you see that we have a different value here. The problem is that now I have to always write the macro every single time. So can I do something that triggers the execution of this code whenever I change the date here? I think that we need a search engine So let's see if I have something here. Okay, I can open a browser. And one moment, I had this in other window, so Google. 1 second. Oops. So here we go. Now we have the browser here, and I look for execute VBA when oh, here we go. Set value changes. Perfect. So let's see the Microsoft documentation. So worksheet change. I think we can copy this code. We can copy this code in our worksheet. Okay, so let's go in Excel. Let's go in our VBA user interface, and in the worksheet 1, I think we are here. So here, because this is the worksheet that contains our table, when we have this and we change selected date, if the intersection is not nothing, then do a message box. Okay, let's start. Let's see if this works. So if I write here 8:16, wow, it works. Wonderful. So we just have to replace now here the code of the example Microsoft provided with the code of my macro. Or I could run the macro, or I can just copy and paste the code here. It's just a prototype. I wanted to see whether this works or not. So let's copy the data here. Here we go. So if I made this correctly, I can now write 15. Bang. No, it doesn't work. So let's see, debug. Right, so there is something here, because at this point we are changing the date. That's interesting. So method range of object worship. Right, so yes, because this is in other. So let's try this workbook dot range, but maybe this is not a property of Excel. So let's see if it works this way. Okay, so let's do worksheets sheet 1. This is me trying to remember how VBA works. Let's try this again. So if I go here and I type 17, debug, no way. So let's stop this. Let's see. So what if I call the macro 1 here? Macro 1. Call macro 1. Let's try. I don't remember that you have to do all this stuff in Excel. Here we go. So with some effort, and now I have something that as soon as I click a new date, I have my table actually refreshed immediately. I could have used the button in Excel that runs the macro. And of course, I could improve my VBA skills for the next video. This is certainly something I have to do. But the basic idea that I wanted to show is that, and let me go back to the to this diagram 1 second. So let me recap what I did. I started with the idea of having an Excel workbook here, this one, which has a DAX query executed connected to a dataset published on powerbi.com. I change dynamically this query according to my needs. And if I want to customize my query, I use DAX Studio here, connected where? usually connected to the local model in Power BI Desktop, because in order to connect DAX Studio to Power BI, you should use XMLA endpoint. If you have them, fine, but during the development, you might prefer to use a local model just because it is faster during the development. Of course, when you go in production, you probably want to use the real data when you are in Excel and you want to retrieve a long list of transactions, a long list of names based on the selection that you input. The advantage of this approach is that the performance is very, very good, and the execution of the query retrieves thousands and thousands of rows in just a few milliseconds, or maybe a few seconds if you have to transfer a lot of data over the wire. So that's all for today. You have seen that I expect many comments from people saying, Marco, you are very bad at VBA, but as you know, my skills are more in DAX today, and when I code more in .NET framework, not much in VBA. Of course, I can improve, so next time I will write better VBA. But if you find better, I expect comments about improvements you can do. I think that this is just the starting point about ideas in how to use the ability to send queries to your Power BI dataset, retrieve data, creating reports, also within Excel to do further elaboration without having to do too manual work to copy and paste data back and forth from a Power BI report. Enjoy DAX!